So I'm excited to be here today. Obviously, great turnout. I've only lived in Marin for about 6 years, but certainly enjoying it, and so excited to kick this off. So talking a little bit about ensuring a healthy planet, so from an entrepreneurship perspective. So we'll jump in, and Kimberly, tell us about Novi and why you started it.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me. Exciting to share a little bit more about Novi. So as mentioned, my background's in data science. I've been doing that in tech my entire career. Actually started off as a data scientist in the Air Force. But I've always had a very strong passion for health, wellness, sustainability, and ultimately in 2017 decided to co-found a company with the former chief marketing officer of Eventbrite to bring a brand to life. And the whole thesis around this brand was to use data to bring better personal care products to market. And so we raised a round of seed funding, started off on our journey, and I got very close to the product development side of the brand, and I'd never done that before. And it was a pretty eye-opening experience, especially from the consumer lens. I didn't actually understand how brands brought products to market. And the thing that I uncovered is that most of these brands have no idea what's going into their products. And I think from a consumer's perspective, we should all be very worried about this because there's no traceability in understanding how the materials are being developed, down to not knowing what materials are being even used in the end product. And so, of course, this was a little bit traumatic because this was our value proposition and what we had built the company around. And so I started to really dive into that and understand, well, how does this work? How do chemical suppliers develop materials? How does sourcing and procurement happen? How does manufacturing happen? And just like pulling back every single layer, ultimately uncovered it was a data problem at the core. And I got very excited about that because that is my background and my sweet spot. And so started building solutions to solve that for brands. And we started solving it for our own brand and ultimately had so much interest from brands around the ecosystem that we saw it as a real business opportunity. And so really just fell into this great combination of my passion for sustainability and experience in data, and that's how we built Novi. I can tell you what Novi is, I guess, is what the question is. Yeah. But so we are a platform that helps brands source materials, but the way we do that is help them identify the materials that have a better sustainability profile, health profile, and so we are a B2B marketplace in that sense, where we work with hundreds of thousands of materials from thousands of different suppliers.
Give an example.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are very focused in the beauty and personal care industry. So just name any skincare brand or any brand that you can think of as they go to make their goop. They want to make their goop more sustainable, better for human health. And we're actually, through our product development platform, helping them design that product and leverage better materials that have a better sustainability profile. And so that's, your traditional marketplace play in that sense.
Awesome. So John, what inspired you to start Trevi Systems?
So my story is a little bit simpler. I was working with Don in 2000. The telecom meltdown happened, and by 2005, we had wrapped up and sold that company. And I took a year off, and that was incredibly boring. So I decided I got to do something. So I went and worked a little bit with some of the VCs in the South Bay on clean tech, and that was my introduction to clean tech. I went and worked with Coastal Ventures. We did a startup up here in Nevada for 2 years. It didn't work out, but it sort of opened my eyes to the problem, that there's a much bigger problem than just making the iPhone 11, 12, 13, 14. It's let's do something better. So that's when I started looking at water, and at that time there was a water crisis, and some of my friends who had farms were complaining they didn't have enough water. So luckily, I decided I could maybe do something there. I knew absolutely nothing about chemistry and water. The only thing I knew about were electrons. So you can imagine there was a learning curve there. I had to open all the books. High school chemistry I started at and said, damn, I hated chemistry in high school and I still hate it, but I have to do it. So we started Trevi in 2010. And we set out to solve two goals, and many of you are probably aware that yesterday or the day before, they voted down the big desalination plant in Huntington Beach in Los Angeles. That was going to provide a couple of % of the water for LA. Small amount, but still, meaningful. And I think the complaints really center on two problems. One is everybody says it uses too much energy. Now, I don't think that's a fair complaint. I think it uses the wrong kind of energy. It uses an energy which isn't renewable, and therefore that makes the climate worse, and therefore you now need more water, and so that cycle has to get broken. So it's not that it uses too much water, because the sun uses 100 times more energy than what a desalination plant uses, just FYI, in order to desalinate. But we don't complain about the sun using 100 times more because it's free. So if we could desalinate using the sun, then we're all the same. The second problem, which is probably the bigger and more valid complaint, was they dump all their brine back to the ocean. Even though they do it better these days than we've done it in the past, it's still a concern. Of course, the sun also dumps all its brine back to the ocean. So, we're not doing anything different than the sun. But I set out and said, okay, let me solve this problem. I'll use renewable energy, so we're no different than the sun. And B, we won't put any brine back in the ocean. And that was the genesis and the founding of Trevi. And if any of you have some time, please come over to the big island of Hawaii, Kona. And at the airport, you'll see a huge Trevi plant. It runs only on the sun, doesn't put any brine back in the ocean. So it does renewable. It solves all the problems that people have been complaining about. Now, reality is, though, there's a third element to this, and that is any new technology, especially like water, carries such a high acceptance bar that even though I can provide certificates that show I meet every water quality parameter, the last question somebody asks me, and they look closely at me and they say, will you feed it to your grandchild? And that is a tough question, because you have to prove zero. You have to prove there's nothing in that water, and proving zero is the hardest thing to prove, right? I mean, you can prove 0.000, but you can never prove zero. So we tend to focus right now on the agricultural communities in California. They have a lot of water under their feet. It's brackish, so they can't use it. If they were to bring it up above ground and desalinate, they'd have a brine. They can't get rid of the brine. That's where we come in. So right now, my first few customers, sadly, are all marijuana farmers, but I got to do what I got to do. So they have a much higher bar to desalinate, so we're trying to help them out. But you've all heard about Saudi Arabia building $1 trillion city in Neom. That can't put any brine back, so we're working with them. We have systems in Cyprus, in Oman, Kuwait. Unfortunately, I started this company to help the California farmers, and 90% of my business is abroad because it's so difficult to get through all the legislation in California.
Yeah, it's a tough market sometimes. So free trips to Hawaii on John. The concessionary business, if it's an impact business, it has to be a concessionary business, right? Is that a myth, or?
You go first.
Okay. Well, I think so if you approach this problem back in 2015, I think there was a theory that this sustainability concept was a trend, and that it was mostly being solved by nonprofits. And so I think that would have been the answer. I think what's interesting today, and the dynamic that we're seeing, is the consumers are changing the conversation, and they're one of the pillars that are driving buying behavior. It's no longer just like a nice to have, it's a must have, especially as the Gen Z conversation and our generation is starting to come into the conversation. So for us, that's number one. Number two is actually just on the tailwinds of COVID and what we're seeing in the economic climate today. Even brands who are not following the new trends of sustainability are forced to make different decisions because they can't get access to the supply that they used to be able to on the same lead times and pricing. And then the other piece of this is also now we're seeing the conversation being driven ESG metrics down at the board level, and we have all of the larger companies, P&G, Unilever, J&J, being forced to make decisions. So I think the new reality is that because of this, the whole ecosystem, in our case in CPG and product development, is having to change. And I think the mechanisms for doing that, everyone is concerned about the bottom line, but also about driving revenue. And from that perspective, a nonprofit isn't the right solution for that. And so we've come in, and if you have the right incentive structures, you can actually drive increased margins, especially on the materials side of the house, and actually build a very, very profitable business from that perspective. So for us, no.
Yeah, nice.
Well, my story is a bit sadder than that. First of all, the sun and by implication, God up there causes it to rain. And so, first of all, water is free because it's given to us by a higher power. And then, secondly, it's written in the United Nations Charter that it's one of the sustainability goals is that all humans have a right to access clean, fresh water, and they shouldn't have to pay for it. But tell that to the $500 million almond tree farmers in the Central Valley who are venture-backed. They don't take that as a good answer. They basically want water, and they're prepared to pay for it. And so for us, right now, trying to sell into the municipal market is very tough because you get met with that first request. Well, is it free, and will you give it to us forever? And I wish my VCs would let me sell it for free, but they don't. So I have to sell it to people that are prepared to pay for it. And where farmers used to get it from the aqueduct for free, or very close to $40 an acre foot, recently it was $400, and then the latest auctions are at $2,000 an acre foot. Now that's more money than the people in San Diego are paying for their RO plant. So the value of water to ag is much higher than what people will pay if there's none of it around. And so I think our focus is to provide water to industry and farmers who are prepared to pay because they own the source of the water. Going to the municipalities, it's a long road.
Yeah, I agree. And I think building on both of what you said, I sort of think there's 5 inevitable trends, and there's probably more that sort of drive, if you're not starting an impact business today, or you're not moving your business in an impact direction, you're going to be at a competitive disadvantage through time. Certainly one is human talent. I mean, more and more people are, heading towards companies they like or, sort of meet their personal goals. 2 is natural capital. So materials and other things like that are getting more expensive, and so how do you dematerialize things or decarbonize things? 3 is financial capital. So more and more, you're seeing large investment funds sort of move in this direction. There's, we do food and ag investing with an impact lens, and 8 years ago we used to be one of the few on the block, and now there's dozens of them. And then 4 is regulatory, more and more regulatory, and then 5 is the consumer. And so with those 5 reasons, if you're not, and there's probably like 8 more, but if you're not building impact into your business, I think you're going to be at a competitive disadvantage. So I think you're tracking with you. So better for you brands and better for you companies often talk a lot about like a systems approach to solving what the problems are that they're doing. Kimberly, how do you think about systems approach? Because we were talking about this a little bit as we were sort of getting ready for today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the interesting piece of this is the reason I started the company before Novi was because I wanted to make an impact, right? So if we could bring a brand, a conscious, very thoughtful brand into the world that was doing right and bringing better products, we could make a big impact and change. And I think what I realized is the system was broken, and so there was no way to do that in a appropriate, it would cost a lot of money, or there really is a lot of friction for a brand trying to bring a sustainable product to market. And so when you start to peel back, and I think that's when I was talking about, there's so many pieces of the supply chain. And so if you look at it from that perspective, we really do have to understand, yes, we're building a solution for brands, but in order to do that, we actually have to break the value chain. And the value chain right now is set up so that brands are not the ones that benefit. They're the ones that are kind of just like left with what's left over. And so we have to build systems and software and architecture to break that value chain and put it back together in a way that services the new lens, which is we have consumers demanding more transparent, better products, and brands are on the hook to do that. And so how do we build the systems to support the brand? And so what's been interesting for me is we are actually building software for manufacturers and for formulators and for chemical suppliers. So you could misconstrue that as like those are our customers, but actually the customer is the brand, because we've had to take this systems approach and understand if you solve for the entire network, you can actually get the output that you want. And so that's for us the big crux or the realization that we had to make.
Yeah, and it creates a moat around the business, right? So now others, if someone else wants to come in and try and do this, they have to disrupt on several fronts, not just 1 or 2 fronts. We look at it as a food and ag investor. We sort of take a soil to shelf approach as well, where we look at everything from the ag inputs and on farm to supply chain to consumer, and try and push the whole system at once. Because if we're not sort of removing demand but not supply, or vice versa, then it's not going to work across the board. So I think besides the military, which thank you for your time, first responders, that entrepreneurs are the next heroes of our society, frankly. And so as and when you see people talk about, oh, we can't do that because it's too expensive, or, we used to be able to, export those externalities to someone else. I just think that's a false argument, that we are a very creative, certainly country. We have the infrastructure from a financing perspective. People love risk here. There's all kinds of people you can get like that. So John, talk a little bit about, you went into a daunting, water's nearly free for a lot of people. It's heavy to move around. Talk about all the chemistry required to be able to get water that's even able to use for agriculture. Walk us through how you thought about sort of disrupting this whole system.
Yeah, and again, it actually is a systems approach, although I didn't know that at the time either. So when we looked at water and we said, well, how do we pull salt out of water? There are very good existing technologies, and they're widely deployed, and they're very inexpensive, and they're mass manufactured, and most of that manufacturing is done in China. So you're entering a well-established, mature, stable field, except that it uses non-renewable energy. And it's very difficult to make it renewable because a water plant, once you turn the switch on, you can't turn it off. And if you turn it off, it's very expensive to restart it. So once you turn it on, it must run 24 hours a day. We talk about a 99.6% uptime is your requirement in order for that thing to make money. I mean, it runs at a very slim, tight profit margin. It must run all the time. So the first problem we had is, well, the sun comes up and down every day and is only up there for 6 useful hours a day. Battery storage isn't anywhere near where it's going to be. So how do you power a plant? And so that's the fossil fuel. So I said, okay, well, we can't store energy then in a battery. That's not feasible. So we'll store it as heat in a tank of hot water. If you went to Hawaii, you'll see a couple of big tanks and they're full of hot water. All we do is heat up water with the sun. And then we said, well, how do we now use that form of heat, which is cheap, not dangerous for the environment, it's just a tank of hot water. How do you desalinate with that? And so we then hired a group of chemists, and we came up with, and this is where we get into deep chemistry, where we sat and engineered molecules, and we spent about 5 years designing molecules. And those molecules have a very special property in that they love water. They love to draw water. But the minute you heat them up, they let go of the water. So we use those to draw water through a membrane, then we heat it up, and then they let go of the water, and then we can drink the water, and then we reuse that special molecule we've engineered over and over again. What I didn't realize is, okay, so we designed the molecule, we're all happy, we high-five each other, but now you need the membrane. Oh, you got to build the membrane. Okay, well, there's no problem with building the membrane. Oh, well, you don't have the heat exchangers, you've got to build the heat exchangers as well. Oh, okay, we'll do that as well. And on, and eventually we're like, we've had to build a whole new ecosystem. The pumps that they use today can't be used to pump our stuff around. We don't want any metal in the system. Our system is built entirely out of plastic, so it can never corrode. So you have to design all the plastics. So it became one of these endlessly large science, which I love science, but man, was this a heavy lift.
That's awesome. And so I think with both of those, if you look at how the landscape or the lens of being an entrepreneur, it's not about a point problem. It's about sort of looking at it from a system and figuring out how do you disrupt or deconstruct that system and then rebuild it in a way that's beneficial to your business models, right? So, and I think, again, it offers differentiation or moat that's hard to go after, right? Because there's a lot of intellectual mindset and property in there. So we're in Marin and Sonoma, so talent. So you're building an impact business in Marin. How is it to find talent, work with talent? How is it up here?
Well, I can start. I think to the comment you made earlier, what has been really incredible for us is since we are building a mission-driven company, we do have a competitive advantage. Talent is extremely hard to get access to, and that's not news to anybody. But we've seen folks that, we're still early stage, have multiple offers on the table. We're the lowest salary offer, but still accept an offer with us because of the mission component. And I think what's interesting when I reflect on founding and starting the company here in Marin is our mission aligns with a lot of the ethos of the community. And so from that perspective, yes, we are a remote company because we grew up in this era and started at the beginning of 2020. And I do think that from a talent recruitment perspective affords us the opportunity to hire very diverse talent and do that across the U.S. But in the same regard, I was actually just reflecting on this. We have a team offsite right now, and you do need to fly everybody in. And from that perspective, that there's carbon emissions and things that don't resonate with our core mission, and that we want to still be able to solve for. So being able to hire locally is very important in that. So I think that's an advantage that we would like and do take advantage of in Marin. So.
And so, talk about culture real quick. If you have a remote, how do you work on and keep culture strong?
Oof, it's a constant communication point. What's interesting though is I have worked at many different companies and culture manifests in different ways, but having a very strong North Star of what you're going after, it helps you weather the storm. And so people are very mission aligned. But I think, a lot of that is...
the purpose is there, right?
The purpose.
Why they're showing up
exactly.
every day. Right?
Yeah.
So John, you're in a bunch of labs.
So unfortunately, I can't outsource a single person. Everybody has to be in my lab all the time because we have all these wet chemistry machines, spectrometers and osmometers and GPC and you name it. So everybody has to be there. So we never even knew COVID existed. We just went to work every day and I just said, wear a mask. Don't talk to anybody else. Exactly. Work at night when nobody could notice you were there. And we went right through because we had no choice. But unfortunately, one of the shortcomings of the North Bay and this whole area in general is it's not an area known for its chemistry or its chemical engineering. All of that happens back east. So that's kind of old school technologies. You think Houston, you think North Carolina, you think Chicago, are where all the big chemistry hubs in America are, where all of that originated. So Silicon Valley or here, there's no talent that I can hire. So it's been a tough job bringing scientists, over to us. Sure, we can fill out the rest of the team pretty easily, but that's been a difficult job because a lot of them, the number one question which I can't answer is, if you lay me off, where do I get a job? So you need more than one, right? So that's been a problem.
Can't just show them the redwoods and that gets them here.
No.
Any questions in the audience? No? Well, if you have any, let us know. What do you think is the future, the vision of Marin? Like, what is your perspective of where Marin's going in Sonoma?
I personally, I get excited about it. I, probably have a overly optimistic view of this, but I think there is this world where we saw the peninsula be kind of more of a nascent place that started to propagate some of the early tech startups we all know about, and that was the hub, and then it started to move up to San Francisco, and I was part of that migration, and Eventbrite was there, and you started to see all these companies move to the city. But I think if I look at like the new trend of companies that are coming out, there's a ton of founders that are very focused on the environment and climate, and that's just a new wave of like you said, venture investing and capital. And I think that Marin is well suited. There's so much talent in this area. It is not like this is an inaccessible area. And you've got folks like me who want to live here and want to raise my family here and put down roots here. And I think a lot of folks thought that this was a place to come to retire after your tech career was over. And then COVID happened and we all moved up here. And so I think this is like an incredible opportunity in my perspective to really change the landscape here and let this be the new phase of business where we have companies that are focused on the future of our Earth and doing good for the environment and for human health, and leveraging the talent that we all know exists in the area. So,
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think I echo those thoughts. I've lived my whole life in the North Bay. We specifically placed the early telecom companies in Petaluma so that we didn't have to go up the Cotati grade, because in those days it was one lane, and now Petaluma is going to go one lane. Yeah. So if I had one wish, could we finish this 20-year road widening project? For God's sake.
All right, that's the future vision. Free trips to Hawaii and finish the lane now.
Yes, I thought you got to get one question. First off, it's a great panel and appreciate what you've done and what you're doing. But I think, aspirationally, we want people to care and to be green. And I don't mean to come back around to a comment I made before, but at the end of the day, it's economics too. And, I think that as we look at desal, and elevating temperature using waste heat and other opportunities, I think we see that as another source of inexpensive water, although as you said, what does inexpensive mean? So I think the real question is, are both of your businesses really dependent on social consciousness, or is it eventually got to be, a more efficient way to produce products and produce water? Because I as much as we all want to care on the coasts and we want to care globally, the basic economics is of scarcity of value, scarcity of capital, and scarcity of consumer dollars. So I think, how do both of your products really affect consumer price? Because I think we can even look at gas prices right now and know the world is at war, and yet there's empathy, and then there's, people, living their daily lives. So I'd love to know, as you look at both of your platforms and their effect on, consumer cost of goods, where's your inflection point where we actually see a declining cost, that a consumer will actually buy?
Yeah, well, I think what's actually interesting from what we're seeing is because shipping costs are so expensive, like the old argument is just go to China. You can get everything much cheaper, and that's what's going to bring consumer price down. But then what we're seeing now is it costs you more to ship the good over here than it costs for the actual cost of the good to start with. And so there's that. And then I think the second thing too is just, the other side of it is the carbon emissions to bring it over. And so what's interesting about that is, since those are the kinds of conversations for the companies that maybe are later to the game on the conscious consumer, they're being forced to make trade-offs and think about their supply chain differently. So there are cost-saving benefits in that regard. But I think the other piece of this is, so what you might not know is in the consumer goods industry, and especially in the industry that I'm in, the margins are actually 80%. So it is up to the brand to adjust the price. And I think what they're finding is, or what we're finding is that your marketing dollar goes a lot longer if you actually can tell a story like this, where I have thought through my supply chain. I know where my materials are coming from. I have transparency. And so you start to save money on those places as well.
Yeah, a great question. I think for us, the decarbonization of the industry is heavily underway. Hawaii has a renewable mandate. By 2040, it can have no carbon. So that's why we're in Hawaii right now piloting. California has the same mandate. In the US, it's still mostly government mandates, and people can work their ways around them. In the EU right now, the European Central Bank will no longer lend money to a desalination plant if it isn't carbon neutral. And in Saudi, in the Middle East, when I travel there right now, they can no longer afford to pump the amount of oil they're doing. They realize they have to keep that in the ground. As they say, they don't want their grandchildren to ride on camels, so they have to keep that oil for as long as they can. So they even are pushing decarbonization. So it's not a hard sell for us, and we're a waste heat machine, and there's 7 gigawatts of installed waste heat just in Africa alone on power plants. So we have a lot of business we can go after. I mean, the trouble is there's a huge problem. There's 17,000 large desalination plants in the world. We're now the world's largest CO2 emitter. Something has to give,
Yeah, I think there's a factoring in the externalities in these businesses that more and more they're being held accountable to, certainly from a regulatory or the consumer as well. I know that so what we're seeing in the food and ag space is that you're seeing the convergence of organic and conventional costing. And so organic's coming down the cost curve faster than, and conventionals going up the cost curve. And part of that is because chemicals are they're taking a lot of the computational capabilities that frankly came out of Silicon Valley, and instead of putting those towards a new dating site or, an ad banner server, they're now putting them towards looking at, Mother Nature and how she might reproduce from a, molecular perspective, to be able to then take that to use it to predict chemicals or a replacement for biologics that would replace chemicals, to be able to have some of these same solutions that used to be a chemical that you used to have to apply. And so that actually can be as good or better. It's not the same green soap that you used 10 years ago that really didn't wash your clothes or your hands. But now I think with a lot of these computational capabilities that are coming into what we're seeing, at least in food and ag, that you can now actually make products that are cheaper than conventional products. So.